Hi, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening for an expert panel discussion and presentation on risks of climate and natural disaster-related disruption to the electrical grid. And for those of us just joining now, please come to the front, please, and join us up here. This evening, we're going to have an opportunity to learn about new research conducted by a team of students at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies on the topic of risk and resilience, which will be followed by an expert panel discussion. The SAIS Energy Resource Environment Practicum is an innovative program that allows students to combine a 4-credit course at SAIS with extensive in-depth real-world experience consulting for a partner organization on projects focused on international environment and energy policy. The practicum is designed to provide quality research and analysis on key global challenges while providing the students with the opportunity to apply concepts learned in the classroom to critical real-life problems. And we are delighted to be working with Swiss Re, a leading global reinsurance company that is committed to developing innovative solutions to major risks facing the world today and in the future. This is the 4th year the SAIS partnership is working, or SAIS is working with Swiss Re, and the previous research topics included wildfire risk, flood risk, and pandemic threats. And after the presentation, I would encourage you all to take a copy of this year's executive summary, and we also have previous year research projects available online and in hard copy as well. So we're very excited to have an opportunity to hear from the expert panel, which includes Swiss Re as well as other colleagues from a diversity of sectors this evening, and wanted to welcome other experts that are in the room as well today. So the topic of today's presentation focuses on the threat of natural disasters to the electrical grids in the Pacific Northwest and their ability to deliver reliable energy services to communities. The topic is particularly relevant against the backdrop of climate change, expanding populations in the area, and insufficient diversification of sources, and all of which make an energy future more unpredictable. And governments are seeking new ways to manage growing threats and the need to more effectively leverage limited public resources. So we need to improve the efficiency of the resources that we have to address these global challenges. In short, this is an area that requires further research, focus, and partnerships. And I'm therefore delighted that the SAIS students are contributing actively to this discussion. And it's my pleasure, therefore, to introduce our student practicum team: Annabella Korbatov, Julia Price-Madison, Yihui Wang, and Yihui. If you would kindly come up and please share with us some of the things that you've learned during your research this year. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening to talk about our presentation on climate and natural disaster electric grid disruption. Over the past year, we've been studying these risks and how they're evolving over time, with a specific focus in the Pacific Northwest, which includes Northern California, Oregon, Washington, and the Canadian province of British Columbia. And we were lucky enough to travel there last month to talk to public and private sector stakeholders about how they're combating these risks today and how they see them evolving into the future. So why are we focusing on the electric grid? For one, it's one of the most critical infrastructure systems of modern life, and all of our lifeline systems are heavily dependent upon it, but it's also very vulnerable. And while we pay a lot of attention to cyber threats to the grid, we pay a lot less attention to weather-related events. And when we do, it's often on superstorms like Superstorm Sandy or Hurricane Katrina, and a lot less attention is paid to lower intensity but higher frequency events that devastate the grid. So for example, in the West, about a quarter of all unplanned outages, which are outages that the utilities don't schedule, are caused by weather-related events or environmental variability. And across the United States, this costs the US economy $20 to $55 billion every year. And this number is steadily increasing. What makes this even more complicated is that these risks are evolving over time as the climate changes and increasing temperatures affect the Pacific Northwest, change the rainfall patterns, and more severe and frequent storms are devastating the area. So you can see in this graph, it goes from 1980 to April 2017, and it shows the billion-dollar disaster events that occur every year. So you can see that in the past 30 years, they've been increasing dramatically. But even in the past 10 years, we can see that severe storms, which you can see in the bright green area, have increased immensely and are costing the US economy hundreds of billions of dollars a year.
So when we're looking at risks of electric grid disruption, it's important to first get a basic understanding of the electricity systems. So this graph shows the typical path of electricity from a power station to a residential building or commercial facility. In the first stage, electricity is generated at power plants, which use various resources, traditional fossil fuels, renewables, or water to generate power. Then the electricity is increased in voltage by transformers before they are fed into the high voltage transmission network that extends itself all over the states. Finally, the voltage of electricity is progressively reduced by substations when finally it's just about 100 volts for supply. So the electricity system is part of a lifeline infrastructures which are critical to human lives and interdependent in nature. For example, the electricity network provides electricity for pumping stations and storage facilities for oil and natural gas sector. And on the flip side, the oil and gas sector provides fuel for electricity generation. As a result, the disruption of one lifeline system may affect the performance of another, and the electricity system is at the upstream of such interdependence. In the face of natural disasters, such as a major earthquake, the disruptions to road networks may impact availability of fuel transportation and thus power generation, which might in turn impact the water treatment, communication services, government and emergency services, and all the commercial and business sectors.
After we understand the whole scope of electricity system and also the evolving risks, we pose this question: who bears the financial risk if there is a disruption after a natural disasters? And most importantly, where are the gaps? We define two stages: the immediate payout and the long-term restoration. In the immediate payout, utilities are the first responders to restore and repair all the transmission distribution lines. Yet the transmission line and substations are the most vulnerable, yet the most expensive ones to actually restore. For example, in Pacific Northwest in 2014, to restore 1 mile of transmission line that cost $1.5 million, and to restore a substation cost about $2 million, and the cost is increasing. At the same time, if the transmission is not destroyed completely, utilities tend to dispatch more generation from other states and transmit the power into the center of the disasters. That not only increase the cost of the ancillary services, such as the regional transmission operators, but also pose a bigger potential of disasters to another region because due to the overload of the transmission line, and that will cause a lot more disruption. At the same time, the state governments need to ensure the backup generations are running for the critical infrastructure such as schools and hospitals. Where the fuel gonna come from for those diesel backup generators, how much that will cost in an event of a natural disasters, that pose a very big question on how much the state government gonna spend out. At the same time, the insurance companies is playing a very tricky role because for the generation facilities, insurance companies usually are able to pay out and insure those facilities. However, for the transmission and distribution lines, the insurance company, traditional insurance products are unable to cover the whole cost, or the cost is too expensive. Therefore, in the immediate payout, where the capital going to come from, that's a big issue. In the long term, the federal government usually are paying or reimburse most of the cost. In the United States, the Federal Emergency Management Agency pays out 75% of the cost after the state file a claim. However, the rest of 25% left to those residentials and business who have just experienced the whole natural disaster. They've lost homes, they've lost the assets, and that poses how will they actually bear the cost of the utilities when the utilities pass down the rates to them, and how the tax increase will increase the cost of living for them, how much will they bear, and the question of if they will actually quit the states and go out. That is a very uncertain. It's uncertain for the states, and also uncertain for sustainable economic development in the long run. On top of everything, the interdependence of the critical infrastructure and evolving natural disasters have, as we discussed, are the very add the layers of the uncertainty. For example, in this picture, as you can see, the flood is everywhere in the city. How will the utilities go to restore the substations in the emergency issue? That will add the labor cost at the time, and also add the cost of the utilities to actually get to the facilities.
And now we take you to Hawaii. So what is a hurricane that happened in Hawaii over 20 years ago, 2,700 miles from the Pacific Northwest, that's the region that we're studying, have to do with grid disruption in Washington or Oregon? Well, this was actually the most destructive hurricane to hit Hawaii in the recorded history of the state, costing $3.07 billion of damages in 2016 terms in USD. It took out nearly all of the island's distribution and transmission infrastructure. Fortunately, generation infrastructure remained largely functional. But what we learned from this is that traditional insurance products are not compatible for protecting the grid, especially when it comes to transmission and distribution infrastructure. So Kauai is a very important and illustrative case study in post-disaster financial recovery and infrastructure recovery. So we were actually lucky enough to meet with Alan Oshima, who is the CEO of HECO, Hawaii Electric Company, the utility in Hawaii, and he told us that, interestingly enough, ratepayers ended up bearing most of the costs of this natural disaster because conventional insurance products are not designed to insure transmission and distribution for a variety of reasons. In most cases, T&D, as it's called, transmission and distribution, is sufficiently dispersed that it's cheaper to repair this damaged infrastructure than to purchase policies for it. Insurance companies don't really offer policies for this because it's very time-consuming and expensive for them to administer these policies. So on the island of Kauai, Lifeline services were powered by diesel generation for 3.5 months. And that's hard to imagine for us. But for 3.5 months, people survived on diesel, coal, and biomass for cooking, for their daily needs, and to power equipment used by emergency responders.
So in the Pacific Northwest, our region of interest, we define the electric grid to not only include the transmission and distribution lines, but also the generation side, as all three components determine how reliable our electricity systems are. As we can see from the left-hand graph, that the transmission lines across western states and Canada are complex and dispersed. And in terms of generation mix, all the 3 states and provinces we looked at are highly dependent on hydropower. In the US, Washington and Oregon led the percentage by having more than about 59% installed capacity as hydro, and they take up about 70% as net power generation. For the British Columbia, the percentage is even higher, which is about 90%. And in terms of multiple risks to the region, as we can see from the graphs, that many of these hydro dams are located in areas vulnerable to high and significant earthquakes. And also from the right-hand graphs, we can see that the risky coastal areas are also where big cities are with high population density. And the generation side is also very vulnerable to water availability and climate change. For example, due to droughts and low stream flows in the Columbia River Basin in 2010, Bonneville Power Administration (BPA) suffered a net loss of about $164 million due to insufficient hydropower generation. And in the same year, it produced much more electricity than the market needed in order to manage flooding and spill. And now let's zoom into Oregon, where we did a case study.
Here's our great picture with the Oregon Resilience Officer, State Resilience Officer. He was appointed by Governor Kate Brown in 2016. His responsibility is to facilitate the conversations among the key stakeholders and agencies to progressively set the legislations to push the mitigation policy forward, as well as to identify and fill the gap for the mitigation efforts for the whole state. The state of Oregon is in the leading way of the whole resilience plan. Other than having the emergency plan that is approved by FEMA in 2010, they come up with this Oregon Resilience Plan of 2013, not only identify the critical infrastructure, but also quantify the financial risk for overall the critical infrastructures under the situation of the Cascadian event. However, we identified 3 major issues that interplays for the future for Oregon to look at, to have a better prepared for all the natural disasters. First is lack of resource diversification. Although Oregon has been trying really hard to get more renewables from other places and also natural gas, the mix of the electricity generation is still highly dependent on hydropower. 50 to 75% of the power generated are from hydropower. As you can see, all the black dots, they are the dams on the major rivers. That interplays with evolving climate change. As we identified, the climate change changed the water pattern overall, and the dams are not built based on all those climate change factors. The capacity will be varies based on seasons, and the cost of electricity might differ based on the different pattern of the rainfall. Along with earthquake and landslides and flood that will actually destroy the transmission distribution lines, the whole electricity system basically are under risk. Overall, the increasing exposure also play into this role because population rising will actually increase the financial cost as well as the cost of restoration. For example, the substations and transmission lines require a huge amount of land. To restore substation near a population-dense area will cost 1.59 times more than restore the substation in a rural area, which means that the $2 million you've seen times 1.59, that's how that trend will get in the future. Along with all those 3 components, we think that Oregon still needs to identify and manage the strategies and plans going forward.
And now for resilience strategies. So there are a variety of resilience strategies being deployed in both the public and private sector to strengthen the electrical grid. First, perhaps the most obvious is electric infrastructure. So utilities will often conduct a vulnerability assessment, especially if they're big enough. And that will help them identify where their vulnerable transmission and distribution infrastructure is. In addition to that, there are a variety of very interesting grid hardening strategies, such as checking poles for rot more frequently, even tree pruning. When we met with stakeholders in Seattle, they said that increasing high winds are putting their poles at risk. So they look at tree pruning as an electric infrastructure strategy. As temperatures rise in the Pacific Northwest, installing more cooling fans and control centers is another example. But going more broadly, we'd like to point out the DOE's Grid Modernization Initiative. And this is an interesting model in which the public sector is partnering with public utility commissions and utilities and other actors in the private and public sector to deploy innovative grid resilience strategies, whether that's on the data and analytics side or the actual grid architecture itself. And on energy, there's diversification of generation sources, increased investment in renewables and distributed generation coupled with storage, and power purchasing agreements or load feeding. In Seattle, for example, Seattle City Lights is the city's municipal public utility, and they rely on hydropower for 86% of their electricity generation. That's not really a very well-diversified generation mix. So in that city, there's growing concern about their hydropower capacity as climate change puts increasing pressure on that. On the finance side, there's insurance, reinsurance, and mutual risk pools. As we've mentioned, traditional insurance mechanisms are not really compatible for protecting the grid, especially when it comes to transmission and distribution infrastructure. So mutual risk pools, such as Aegis, exist. Aegis was formed in 1975 by 12 utilities to serve utility and related energy industry members. And they offer insurance products that the private sector, for various reasons, cannot, such as energy operations and exposure and risk transfer mechanisms for climate risk and unplanned outages. There's also parametric insurance, which is an innovative insurance mechanism that allows people to tailor their insurance coverage to a specific risk, like a triggering event, like a 6.0 earthquake, for example. And on the legislation and policy side, there are innovative insurance laws. The state of California, for example, a few years ago pioneered a law that requires their insurance companies to provide policyholders with the option of purchasing earthquake insurance. And interestingly, not all of the insurance companies left the state. They are providing earthquake insurance for people who want it, and Oregon is actually following suit. The state resilience officer is currently working to push that bill through to the finish line. Building codes are another form of resilience. Unfortunately, they're not uniform across states, and in British Columbia, their building stock is vulnerable because any residential buildings under 3 stories are exempt from seismic retrofits. And lastly, intergovernmental coordination and information exchange between public and private sector partners like public utilities, the utilities themselves, NERC, FERC, and DOE, and other regulatory agencies is key to boost resilience of the grid. And lastly, gaps and challenges. So the main gaps and challenges when it comes to strengthening the grid break down along the policy and regulatory gaps, financial burden, risk perception, and data availability. On the policy and regulatory side, there really isn't a very robust policy enabling environment to promote investment in the electrical grid and boosting resilience in the electrical grid. For example, as I mentioned, there's a lack of uniform building codes in many states, and in British Columbia, for example, where their building stock is at risk. On the risk perception side, briefly going back to the policy and regulatory gap also, it's important to mention that public utilities are limited in their power. They provide economic regulation of utilities, but they cannot compel utilities to conduct vulnerability assessments and make certain investments. That's another important point to note. On the financial burden side, like we mentioned, this over-reliance on FEMA, from whether it's by private individuals, utilities, or state governments, really isn't meeting cost recovery needs. So it's leaving states and individuals exposed. So even after FEMA pays out and insurance pays out, a lot of municipalities and states are left with huge recovery costs. What ends up happening quite often is that states have to raise taxes, and municipalities pass on those taxes to consumers. And the Public Utility Commission in Hawaii, actually going back to Kauai briefly, ruled that utilities cannot encumber consumers with prohibitively expensive insurance policies to ensure transmission and distribution infrastructure. So what ends up happening is that ratepayers like you and me end up paying much higher costs for electricity to cover recovery costs that weren't covered by insurance or FEMA. On the risk perception side, in our meetings with stakeholders in the Pacific Northwest, both in the public and private sector, there was a theme emerging that people, ordinary folks, or even people who work in the industries themselves, are not fully appreciating these risks and the urgency of these risks, and why it's important to increase investment in grid resilience. And that's closely related to the issue of data availability. Because if governments don't have good data and can't fully appreciate the risks, they can't plan accordingly. for high frequency, low intensity events or high intensity, low frequency events like the Cascadia subduction zone event. So this data is, these issues are staggeringly complex and they're layered. You have climate change as a big background effect, and then you have floods, storms, earthquakes, the lower intensity, high frequency events, and then you have the big epistemic risks, which these are the risks that we can't even imagine, the risks that will break our models because they produce outputs we didn't even anticipate. So as you can see, all of these gaps and challenges create, if you will, a perfect storm. And it makes strengthening the grid increasingly difficult to weather natural disaster-related risks. Thank you.
All right, well, that was terrifying. Thank you very much for that excellent research and presentation. And now we're just going to turn to the second part of our presentation this evening and really have a robust discussion about this. I hope that you were taking note of any questions that you had on some of the research that the students presented. And it's now my pleasure to welcome the panelists up to the front here. Each of you, there is a handout available with the bios of the panelists, so I will just do a brief introduction as they are all very qualified individuals to be having this discussion with us this evening. Alex Kaplan is the Senior Vice President of Global Partnerships for Swiss Re, where he develops and executes innovative risk transfer solutions to help governments, international financial institutions, and NGOs at all levels manage their financial risk. And prior to joining Swiss Re, Alex served as a deputy to the Assistant Secretary for Legislative Affairs for the U.S. Department of Treasury under Secretary Hank Paulson. Craig Zamuda is a senior policy advisor at the U.S. Department of Energy, where he currently provides policy and technical advice on the department's energy sector vulnerabilities, resilience, and preparedness. He represents his agency in domestic and international platforms to advance resilience, and he currently serves as the lead author of the energy section of the 4th U.S. Global Change Research Program National Climate Assessment. And David Comas serves as an energy program manager at the Maryland Energy Administration, where he focuses on solar, energy storage, nuclear energy, and grid resilience. David previously served in the U.S. Navy and helped the Department of Energy develop the first strategic sustainability performance plan, as well as their first greenhouse gas inventory. And Katie Jariza is experienced in developing public-private partnerships for national security and resilience that actually serve as models for other critical infrastructure sectors, including nuclear, water, and chemicals. So Katie is currently the Director of Infrastructure Resilience at the Edison Electric Institute, where she co-leads the Smarter Energy Infrastructure Initiative while serving as co-secretary of the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council. So we have an excellent panel, and I do want to note we have a lot of distinguished individuals in the audience today, and I would like to hear from them as well throughout the panel discussion. So with that, why don't we kick off our discussion? It'd be interesting to hear some of the data presented by the students is quite staggering. We're looking at $20 to $55 billion in annual financial loss from power outages caused by the range of threats, flooding, hurricanes, and extreme temperatures. What are some of the challenges in understanding this risk and managing these exposures from all of your perspectives? So if you could kindly address that question and provide a little bit of the context with your respective institution, and maybe Alex, ask you to kick it off.
Sure. Thanks, Celeste. And first of all, let me congratulate the students on great presentation, great work thus far. Can't wait to see the final product, which will carry you through the entire summer, so don't think that you're getting off easy. Thanks for having me. Just for people's background, Swiss Re is a reinsurance company. So think of that as effectively insurance for insurance companies. As the global aggregator of risk, we have to have a really good perspective of what's happening in every corner of the globe and how they correlate with one another, not just tomorrow and the next day, but looking way far down the road, maybe perhaps even 100 years. When we talked about this particular topic for the practicum students, thinking about our electrical grid, thinking about the shifts in supply and demand and the changing evolution of the risk of weather, what we obviously see is the cost of disasters has increased fourfold over the last 30 plus years. And the number that Celeste and the students highlighted, $55 billion a year on the high end, in terms of total economic disruption as a result of unplanned outages, right? I know that's in the context of the U.S. economy may seem insignificant, but that's the GDP of Uruguay. And so we should not dismiss the fact that these slow bleeding events don't equal something greater over the long term. We have to think not only just about physical resilience of these assets and the physical destruction and the loss of these assets and what it costs to replace them, but we also have to think about the impact of extreme weather and how it destroys capital returns for the energy sector over the longer period of time, right? Every time there's a disruption, every time they're missing quarterly earnings, or every time they're not generating electricity, which they sell to ratepayers, is another dollar that they're not investing in clean technology or new sustainable solutions further down the road. And to the point you made about diversification, I think is critical, right? Think about, said 90% of British Columbia's production is from hydro, right? To me, I immediately think of that in the context of our retirement accounts. Could anybody in this room even contemplate the idea of putting their entire retirement savings into one stock? You would never do that, right? So we have to think about that, the distribution, the diversity of the resources that we have. Weather's one thing, but obviously Cascadian subduction zone earthquake is an entirely different risk, which will keep all of us up at night. So I might just leave it there for now.
Thanks, Alex.
Should I just
Yes,
jump in?
please, great.
Okay, so once again, I'm Craig Zamuda from the Department of Energy. And so many people may not be aware of exactly what the Department of Energy does. They may not be the only ones in the country that may not know that. It's kind of an inside joke there. I'll let the humor subside. But I'd say the work presented here today, I think, is right on target. I mean, we're recognizing, as you are, that the energy system is vulnerable. It's vulnerable to a number of potential threats, not only natural threats like extreme weather, as was noted, kind of leading contributor to power to outages, but from cyber threats, from physical threats, et cetera. So there's a host of potential risks to the existing energy system. And the cost is becoming staggering in terms of just annual costs today. Much of the comments, I think, today was really focused on kind of the current system, current climate we have, the current energy system we have, and we need to recall that not only are we seeing recent trends in terms of the cost and frequency of these outages, but all projections are that that's only going to increase, that these extreme events are only going to increase in terms of intensity, frequency, and duration throughout our lifetime. The other thing that we should keep in mind is, and it's kind of noted in part, is not only is the climate and the environment changing, but the energy system itself is going through dramatic change. And that can either enhance vulnerabilities or reduce them, or a combination of the two. But we have an aging infrastructure. The average age of a coal plant out there is, throw out a number. What's the average age of a coal-fired power plant? Coal-fired? Correct, 45 years. I don't think anyone said that, but there you go. So it is an aging infrastructure. But there are other changes taking place other than just a technology that was built in a different generation for a different set of environmental conditions. We have transitions in terms of accelerated deployment of renewables, wind and solar, a variable and fluctuating energy source. So base load's important. You have a challenge there. We have smart grid and microgrid technologies, a smarter grid that's allowing you to detect outages much more quicker, perhaps isolate them, but also not only gives those that we want the ability to better control the grid, but perhaps those that we don't want to control the grid. So that introduces vulnerabilities into the system. So there's a cast of changes going on that influence reliable, secure, and affordable energy. Some of those are changes in the energy system itself. Some of those are the threat environment and the stress multiplier of climate, et cetera. In the department, we're looking at these risks. We're looking at it both from a technology perspective. As we said, much of this technology is fairly dated. We're looking at opportunities for innovative, more resilient energy, deploying more resilient energy technologies. We're looking at the information gap in terms of better downscaled climate science information so we can look locally, not simply globally, at what the implications may be for a changing climate, and be able to provide that information to local decision makers so that they can incorporate that into their resilience planning and ensure that we have a reliable energy system. But also from a policy framework. As was noted, what do we have in terms of incentives to invest in a more resilient system? We talked about who pays. Quite frankly, we all pay. And it's a question really of, do you want to pay now or do you want to pay later? But the cost will increase. We have an energy system that is vulnerable at this point, and we can either do the prudent thing, and that is start making some wise, cost-effective investments today, or we'll pay the cost later, and it may be cheaper to do those wise investments today and avoid that future cost, which will be significant. So let me stop there and simply say, as a department, we're looking at innovative technologies. We're looking at enabling policy frameworks. We're looking at better information to help the resilience planning. I guess the last point I'd make in terms of recognizing that we're all in this together, we are working more closely with stakeholders. We have, for one example, a partnership with electric utilities. About 20 electric utilities across the entire country, including Seattle City Light that was mentioned earlier, who are committed to building a more resilient system, who are identifying their vulnerabilities, they're doing those vulnerability assessments, they're developing resilient strategies, and we're assisting them in that process to come up with accepted methodologies, tools, and information to help drive that process. So there are things that can be done, but the pace, scale, and scope of those activities need to increase. And it needs this kind of work to help make this issue visible and serve as a driver for additional actions as we move forward.
Thanks, Craig. That's really helpful. And I just wonder, I think we'll get into it a little bit more, the interplay between state and federal. But, David, picking up on Craig's comments, how do state agencies prepare on the resiliency side?
State agencies is where the rubber meets the road. The concern is, I hate to say it, is not about insurance. It's not about the money. It's about the people. It's about recovering your society. So the state has command centers that deal with National Guard. They deal with each of the major utilities. And it's not just electricity. It's electricity, water, sewage. And so the major state concern is the people. Now, one of the concerns, someone like myself, if I had to, I could get in my car, I have enough gas, I could leave the area, fine. That's not true for many of the people in the inner cities. They're stuck there, they can't get out. We saw what happened in New Orleans. That was a little bit different, but it's what happens when a population is stuck. They have to get emergency services. One of the concerns that the states worry about are, I'm going to use the word resiliency hubs, areas that government knows are secure buildings, are areas where people will congregate, where equipment, or, excuse me, where food and energy deliveries can be pre-staged, areas that potentially can keep the lights running even in a major issue because they have solar or wind or they have a backup generator, which brings me to the next point. In a major issue such as the one that's being discussed here, a lot of buildings are going to have backup generators. And I'm not sure if the panel looked at what is the time frame for which those generators are designed. 3 days, 4 days, 72 hours is normally a good one. A week, 2 weeks. If you have solar or wind tagged in with diesel generators, you can extend the period before you need refueling. And that's one of the other major resiliency issues to be concerned with. But that is a major issue. As we start moving towards microgrids and islanding capabilities, which the Department of Energy is working for, and many states such as Maryland are trying to develop, we may end up with small areas that retain power during an emergency. Now, one other thing I wanted to bring up, which I brought up on the pre-call, if you think of just something like Hurricane Katrina, it was bad, but it isn't what we're talking about today. We're talking about the lights going out all the way from Stockton, California, all the way up to Vancouver and beyond, where your nearest cheeseburger is 800 miles away. It's just to put it in perspective. There's no clean water. Your sanitation has broken down, and those are two key areas that help maintain the civil society that you need to bring back. Where is the help going to come from? We can talk about FEMA, which can get people on the road, but where's the help going to come from? And a lot of that comes down to a civil defense plan and NORTHCOM, the United States military and National Guards. They need to be considered in this. Where is it going to come from? From these centers, they have the equipment, they have fuel stocks, they have people that are used to working in these types of conditions. Those are things that need to be filtered in. And having said that, I'm going to step back and hold my fire.
Thanks, Craig. Katie, welcome your perspective.
Okay, so I'll just mention real quick who the Edison Electric Institute is and the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council. We represent the investor-owned utilities. There's also public powers, which are the municipals, and then cooperatives. And so IOUs supply or deliver energy to over 200 million Americans. So we have a big chunk of the electricity delivery market. And we also employ over 1 million workers. So I think that's kind of cool. We're a big part of this nation's economy. And I'd like to commend the researchers on your choice of doing this study. When I was your age, I thought electricity was boring. And I have to say...
Try insurance.
And today, it has never been more exciting. I've heard some of the panelists talk about grid modernization. We're calling it smarter energy infrastructure because you're always going to be kind of in this mode of grid modernization, but we are looking to make it smarter. So about the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council, so I can also speak a little bit about the entire industry, not just investor-owned utilities, because this is a CEO council, there's 22 of them on there, and there's 9 trade associations. So we realized after Superstorm Sandy that better coordination was needed. And so we formed this council, and when you have executives on it, you know that you get the priorities and you get the resources. And this has been going on for about the last 3 or 4 years. And there's a lot of really neat stuff that we're working on. And so while some of you might be a little scared about what you're hearing today, I'm here to let you know that this industry it's a top priority, resilience, and we've been doing a lot for a long time and investing a lot to address these kind of issues because we know that life is at risk and safety and civil unrest is absolutely something that we don't want to see. So on that note, I'd like to just talk about how the industry views risk. So there's a wide range of risks that the industry has to take a look at, from squirrels, which sounds very mundane, and where I live in Maryland, in Annapolis, we've got osprey, we call them avian hazards, to earthquakes, and there's Cascadia Rising that Yihui, it's an exercise where our industry gets together and goes through a role play event of how to deal with that. And I can speak to what some of the utilities are doing to manage those risks. And I use the word manage because we can't really ever be 100% secure or be able to 100% prevent these type of events. We recognize that they're going to happen. So we have, our approach is to look at, from an industry standpoint, it's 3 legs of the stool. There's regulation, there's government industry coordination, and then there is actual preparedness and response. So those are the different ways that we look at it, and I can get into a little more detail on that as we go forward. So some of the priorities that we look at, and just from a risk standpoint, we mentioned cyber, but there's also electromagnetic pulse, there's nuclear weapons. We think the government can help us out with that. But for industry coordination, we look at the response on a national level when there is a severe storm or an earthquake event or even ice storms. Those are things that our utilities really worry about. So what are we doing about it? The Electricity Sector Coordinating Council has a playbook. They meet 3 times a year. We look at things also as supply chain security, and we look beyond today. So we know that we have to harden for today's events, but looking into the future, what are we doing about electromagnetic pulse? What are we going to do to communicate? That's a very that's a top issue for us. So how do we communicate, not just from digitally equipment to equipment, but we're talking person to person. If things go down, that's still a major issue for the industry. We also need to look at advanced information sharing capabilities. So what can we do to monitor and detect and respond from an information sharing standpoint? And then longer term, we're even looking at automated response. And this gets more to the cyber threat, but that has to happen very quickly. But there's a lot of things happening today that in the automation realm that we saw in Matthew that I can touch on with investments. So with that, I'd like to just give you a little bit of statistics here. So IOUs, so the investor-owned utilities, have spent $160.6 billion from 2012 to 2015 on hardening and smartening their infrastructure. That's about $40.2 billion a year. In 2016, they're spending $52.8 billion in just last year. So that's something that I thought you would find interesting. Hurricane Matthew, I know that in a way they were somewhat lucky. We talked about this panel when we were prepping about how do you get folks to invest. And we live in a society where if it doesn't happen, do you really need it? Are you gold plating the grid? And so there were 7 hurricanes from 2004 to 2005. So they were able to invest $2 billion in hardening. And so they did that, but then it took 12 years for Matthew to come around. So, but during Matthew, none of the poles that they hardened fell from the winds. It took them 2 days to get 99% of their million customers back online. And the switches, automated switches, prevented 80,000 power outages. So I thought you'd be encouraged to hear that there's a lot going on, and we're getting better at it.
Thanks, Katie. That's really fascinating. You know, it's the incentives. How do you actually get folks to think about what we might refer to as pre-covery as opposed to after the event? And David, to your point, absolutely. We've got Northcom, PAYCOM. We've got our federal agencies across the board, not just FEMA, but DOD, really picking up a lot of the disaster recovery efforts. And so shifting that to pre-event, I think, is the challenge that everybody worries about. And it's reassuring to hear, at least on the private side, Katie, that folks are thinking about that and investing forward. We have so many experts in the audience as well. I don't want to actually control the mic too much. And I actually might go right to questions from the audience, and I hope that you've been taking some notes. And you can also direct questions to the researchers as well. We have a mic that we'll be passing around. Does anybody have a question for the panelists and or the students? We have, let's take this one over here, Professor Wright, and then we'll go over to you.
Hi, I'm Mark White. My question relates a little bit to the huge growth that we've seen in the impact of the storms. A lot of the effect is actually the effect of development in the areas that the storms hit rather than the actual severity of the storm, although that could well be changing as well. But it seems to me that development on the coasts or in areas where we're very vulnerable, it just is kind of an exponentially growing thing. So I was wondering if either the students or the panel could talk a little bit about how severe things could really get if we follow those trends out.
Annabella, do you want to touch on the research or?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we met with stakeholders in the state of Oregon, the state resilience officer and state agencies, we spoke about this issue about the development on the coastline, Oregon's coast, and what would happen during a Cascadia event, but also during a lower intensity event. And what we learned is that those areas are highly vulnerable and that a incredibly intense event like Cascadia, which is a combination 9.0 seismic event plus a tsunami.
So that's like a Fukushima style event taking place off the coast of Oregon?
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly.
To clarify.
And the last time it happened in Oregon, I believe, is about 300 years ago. So they have not experienced that event in recent memory, and so preparedness is a huge issue. So what would happen to those coastal communities is just utter depopulation. They do not expect those communities to recover, and they just expect outmigration. And so for those communities there, living there right now, we learned that there has been increased investment in moving schools and other critical infrastructure out of vulnerable zones and moving them closer inland. But it's expected that even in a lower intensity event that the people that don't live there year round, which are vacationers, and they tend to be more affluent people, will be able to move inland. And the folks that live there year round who work in the service industry and also in schools and fire and all the other critical infrastructure, those people won't be able to move, and so those municipalities will probably see their tax bases so greatly reduced that it will be incredibly difficult to cover full recovery costs. So that's something that the state of Oregon is incredibly worried about right now, and that they're trying to mitigate, but there aren't any really great answers.
Yeah.
Alex, please.
Just to add, I think that actually the biggest risk we face at all is the fact that humans like to live where the topography is interesting, right? Whether it be by a river or an ocean or next to a mountain, which is a result of a seismic event, that is the biggest challenge. In Florida alone, you have almost $600 billion worth of assets within 6 feet of the high tide line. And that number is obviously just growing exponentially. And if you take it to a very local level, looking at how that risk is evolving, particularly in a place like Miami Beach. Miami Beach, if you looked at it 90 years ago, it would be completely unrecognizable as it is today. Their sewage system is gravity-based. And they are now realizing, because of sea level rise, they have to switch the entire infrastructure system from a gravity-based system into a pump-based system. That's going to require electricity, obviously, to make that happen. And so you have a risk which is actually forcing greater demand. So I'm really encouraged to hear about all the investments that the industry's making. And part of the question I always have is, why did they feel compelled to do that? What was the main driver, aside from preventing disruptions? But what were some of the other factors that were considered when saying, you know what? Yes, we're losing $20 to $55 billion a year because of unplanned disruptions, but we're going to spend $42 billion a year to harden our assets. The economic picture for them must be much considerably larger than that.
Could I just kind of add to that answer? And, you're talking about we live and build in some interesting areas, but sometimes there's a real logic that permeates the decision-making process. I mean, the reason why power plants are located next to water bodies is because they use a tremendous amount of water, particularly if they're thermoelectric power plants. However, if you look at a changing energy system, and you look at a system that moves away from thermoelectric power generation and one towards wind and PV solar and other such things, the need for water is significantly reduced, if not eliminated. Even for thermoelectric power plants, although now there's an energy and cost penalty, you can move towards dry cooling technologies. So what might have made sense in the last century may need to be revisited, and we have solutions that are already commercially available to help move the system to a more resilient system. And not only more resilient, but in the process of getting additional co-benefits. So if you move to wind and solar, you're also reducing your greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a lot of potential opportunities to use commercially available technologies, although coming from a energy department, we think there's always opportunities to enhance those technologies, come up with more innovative technologies that are focused on the challenge that we're talking about here today.
And just one comment, going back to the cost factor in the event of a disaster, the Kauai model is interesting because if the lights are on or power being supplied by diesel, of course, that's when you're looking at an island context, that's imported, right? So, and there's further costs associated with that as well. Let's take 2 more questions at a time. Judah, please.
Sure. I really appreciated the presentation.
And sorry, could I interrupt? Could you please identify the organization that you're with?
Sure. I'm Judah Rose. I'm with ICF. We're a consulting firm here in the area and do a lot of work on resilience and climate change and the electric power industry. And so what I wanted to just make a few comments and then sort of ask a question, which is most of the work that we do is in the area between the states and the utilities, where there's a dialogue about what the nature of the risks are, and there's a lot of decisions that are made in that context. But since the 2005 Energy Policy Act is also a more elaborate and federal path which hasn't been discussed, and I just wanted to make an observation about that and then raise that as an issue. So in the 2005 Energy Policy Act, we created a thing called the Energy Reliability Organization, which is NERC, which has mandatory authority to require reliability. And one of the lesser-known activities of the industry through the ERO is mandatory reliability requirements, where you, for example, go through and test the resilience or the reliability of the system to individual component outages for all components up to 2 at a time. And there is also a separate process that has identified these types of problems that are sort of larger multiple contingency events, but they're not enforced either on a planning basis. And so they're sort of set aside and recognized but not sort of tested. So my question is there is a very elaborate federal process. It has enforcement powers. And it is very detailed with respect to the individual components of the system that could be damaged in any event. And do panelists and do the students feel like that system is being exercised enough? Is it, if you will, becoming an active forum for these types of considerations? Because if you upgrade some of the things that are not enforced, some of the contingencies, the system itself would become more resilient, at least to that contingency, and likely to be more resilient generally. So again, the question is, what about the federal process? What about NERC? And how do people see that role of NERC in that regard?
Thank you. And I think Josh had a question also behind you. We'll take 2 questions and turn it over to the panelists.
Thanks, Celeste. Josh Soslag with AECOM. We're a big infrastructure company globally. We're probably the biggest company some of you have never heard of. So let me just start with where the last question was, and it's interesting when you define resilience in a utility context, it has traditionally been reliability. There were three things they cared about: reliability, reliability, and reliability. We've been doing some work with Medicine in Chicago, which is one of the Exelon companies, on really looking at how to define those metrics in a utility context for resilience, because it's different than it is for an investor-owned utility because of the regulatory structure. And we're starting to see in some markets, California is one of them, where the regulators and the investments that Katie talked about are regulated at the state level in order for them to get paid back in the rate for that work. They've got to convince the state regulator that this is a good investment. For the municipal utilities, they got to convince the local taxpayers that this is a good investment. But the problem becomes it's a lot easier to pay for it on the back end because everybody saw the thing happen. But it's really expensive on the back end. And for the municipal utilities, the federal government is coming in and paying for some of that. For the investor utilities, they're not, with the exception of Katrina, where there was actually some federal money that went into one of the investor utilities. By and large, federal money is not going to the investor utilities post-disaster. They're having to go back and build that into their rate case. And so I think there is a fundamental issue about how we invest in resilience in the utility sector and really make that argument both at the state level, at the municipal level, and at the federal level, that these are costs that we have to be very concerned about. And I'd be interested if either the researchers or the panel has really kind of thought about how those different players, different stakeholders, can get addressed in this process. One last thing, which is if you haven't talked to the Energy Infrastructure Security Council, the EIS Council, they are actually doing some work on this.
Craig, please.
Jump in. So, between the two, a lot of interesting components embedded in the two broad questions. I'd say, I think one of the key points is this distinction between reliability and resilience. So, the industry has had much more experience around reliability than resilience. And if you look at the metrics that are used for resilience, one might argue there aren't really any adopted metrics out there today. So you have things like SAIDI and SAFE and CAIDI for reliability, not so much on the resilience side of things. And so the real challenge is how do you look at these low probability, potentially high impact type of events, and how do you treat them differently than the algorithm we've kind of set up to deal with kind of blue sky outages in the reliability context. And I would just kind of end on the fact that in the absence of metrics to help measure the degree of resilience a utility has, or the degree to which an investment would enhance resilience, to the degree we do not have standards that help define how you should build a quote-unquote resilient utility, to the degree we don't have standardized adopted methodology for how you even do the cost-benefit analysis of looking at these investments. So if you're a regulated utility and you're going before that Public Utility Commission and you've just had a significant storm event like a Superstorm Sandy or fill in the blank for your favorite storm event, how do you make the case to the regulator that these are prudent investments in the absence of all the things I've just outlined? So it's a real challenge. This is probably one of those few areas where when people come to this town, including folks from the electric utility industry, they may actually say, we need greater standardization in the process. We can use that then to help facilitate decision-making, and in the absence of that, there's kind of one-off ad hoc decisions, and I don't mean it in kind of a truly negative way, but people, I think, are really struggling to figure out how do you come up with that cost-effective decision and what is not adequate enough in terms of building back better, and what's gold plating.
Did you want to respond to that, Katie?
Sure. I guess just a couple things. From the federal level, the critical infrastructure protection standards that he was referring to, compliance is pretty severe. It's $1 million per violation per day if you're not compliant. So that's a fairly good incentive for the reliability critical infrastructure protection standards. There's a lot going on with NARUC at the state level, so that's another one that you might want to look at. And so for, trying to get my train of thought here. So it is difficult with the standards, and so having that when you know that you get ice storms in the north but not in Florida, or earthquakes in the northwest but not in Maryland, although we had that teeny one. Weather is different, so it varies across the country. I had the pleasure of working with NIST a few years ago on community resilience standards. I'm not sure how that ended up because I dropped out of that project, but they spent about $3 million looking specifically at resilience standards for the community, of which electricity was one of those. So those are probably evolving as we speak. Another driver to think about when we're doing these standards that I just wanted to mention before I forgot, we're doing this also in a state of declining load. Those energy efficiency standards are working pretty well, those programs. And so how do you pay for something when you pay by the kilowatt hour? So the industry's looking at new business models, regulators are as well, and that's a work in progress. So I hope that helps a little bit.
Thanks. Kurt, you might want to comment on that relationship, right, between the state and PUC as well. Sorry, David.
Actually, I just wanted to make a comment that much of the infrastructure planning is actually being done, at least on the East Coast, through the RTO at the PJM level. So the state.
I'm going to challenge you to break down all those acronyms.
Okay.
I know we're in DC, but still.
A regional transmission organization, an RTO, could be an independent system operator, an ISO, who's responsible for the market making for the bulk electricity movement. And if you've never taken a look, the PJM, which actually stands for Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, the way business is conducted is almost opposite the way it is in California, whereas on the East Coast, about 90% of the transmission is all merchant, whereas in California, it's almost all point-to-point bulk transmission. So the organizations work very differently, but they're responsible for ensuring that transmission lines are where they need to be 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now, and to go work through a lot of the resiliency issues. So it's not necessarily within a state's prerogative under an RTO organization to make that happen.
Do you want to comment?
I'm way out of my ballpark.
Okay. Okay, we have a question back here, please. And please identify yourself.
I'm Jacob Scher, and I'm an attorney here in Washington. I've worked on a broad range of climate change and energy issues for many, many years. Alex, you remarked that in the insurance industry, you have to look 100 years ahead, and I'd be curious if the members of the panel would be willing to look 15 or 20 years ahead and talk about what kind of energy system are we going to have, what kind of energy system are we going to need, and how can we really then make sure that it's going to be able to perform under that notion where we're going to be 15 or 20 years from now, what do we need to do the next 3 or 4 years to make sure? To what extent, and just to add to that, to what extent our discussion that we're having today about resilient electric infrastructure is part of the broader discussion in Washington, potential major investment is infrastructure.
Great, thank you, Jacob.
Maybe I just want to take that first.
Yep. Let's see. Katie, you have You look like you want to take that one first. So basically, what do we need to do?
Could you restate the question? Yeah.
Well, let me, sure, I'll try to reframe. What needs to happen in the next 3 to 4 years to ensure that we have the right energy mix in place to address some of the challenges that I think that we've been discussing? What do we anticipate that landscape actually looks like based on what we know today?
Oh, sure. I don't mind answering that because I probably looked at 5 different models where they were looking out to 2050, and they were all over the place. And then I stayed in a cabin in Lake Placid and looked at a 1970s life book that thought we would be all nuclear by now. So predicting the future is just so much fun. So diversity and mix, all of the above strategy is a good one. I think they talked about the reliance on hydro. So if you were to look at that mix graph, you'd say probably 50 years ago, most of that was probably hydro. The idea was affordable electricity to folks. And then over the last, I don't know, they say they've been evolving over 50 years, so I don't know exactly when they've really ramped up. But especially in the Northwest, you see more wind, more solar, more battery storage. So energy storage is a big thing, and more of that's coming online, but we still have a long way to go with that. So 50 years, we've got to do better. I think energy storage will be in a place where it will make a much bigger impact. Political winds and the public change things a lot. I think nuclear would have been much more prevalent had 3 Mile Island not happen or Fukushima, because even there was going to be a lot of investments, and that's a terrific, affordable, zero carbon output energy source. So I guess that's sort of where I'm sort of thinking about things are heading.
Can I jump in?
Yeah,
So I mean, just real quickly, I mean, I'd add to the point where, the challenge is how do you deal with uncertainty, right? I mean, we don't have a centrally planned energy economy here. And there's always surprises. If you look at natural gas, the role of natural gas today, and asked yourself 10 years ago, 20 years ago, would you envision natural gas would be displacing coal? Would you have envisioned renewables be moving as aggressively as they are? Would you envision technological innovation like a smarter grid and the options of microgrids, both to island in case when the central power goes out or just in general? It's a changing system, so how do you move forward in an era of uncertainty, both on the energy system itself and in the stress multipliers around it, like climate change and extreme weather? And I'd say with regards to the latter, with regards to climate change, I mean, we can kind of see the direction it's going, and no one can absolutely predict the future, but you get a general trend of where things are likely to go. And so in terms of making any kind of investments, and if, in town we're talking about a big infrastructure investment, okay? In terms of making any investments, we ought to be factoring in considerations of things like climate change. And we ought to be considering how can we ensure that the technologies, the infrastructure we're deploying tomorrow is climate resilient ready, so that we're not precluding the option to make that, to make those investments that we may be unwilling to fully make today. And I'd say that notion of considering climate in the decision-making process today, and considering it not from it's either ignore it or you gold plate it, but are there incremental ways to move forward in tandem with a changing climate so that, and I'll go back to Superstorm Sandy as an example, billions have been spent to build back better. In many cases, they were fairly simplistic things. You build your seawall, you go to the FEMA 100-year floodplain and add 3 feet, and that's going to be the protection you want. Others in different states, Con Ed, that's their guiding principle. It's the 100-year flood and 3 feet. Public Service Electric and Gas in New Jersey, they're going to the FEMA 100-year floodplain flood event, but they're only going up a foot, okay? So they are basically saying the regulators in that state aren't allowing them to take a more conservative approach to investing. But here's the point of climate readiness. If you structure and design your seawall so that you can add incrementally as you go, then maybe you've made a prudent investment that has perhaps deferred that larger investment that you would need to make, but allows you to kind of do that in a cost-effective manner. So that's just kind of one example of climate readiness, but there may be others as well.
I would just add one point, which I think maybe not what others would expect, which is that changing the regulatory framework, which enables the insurance industry to invest in infrastructure, right? We talk about this massive infrastructure gap in terms of what we actually need to be doing and the money we have to do it. And if you think about the insurance industry globally, in terms of assets under management, it's 1.5 times the size of the entire US economy. So there's about $29 trillion of capital that's ready to be deployed that needs to be invested in various forms. And providing infrastructure, even energy infrastructure, as an asset class that insurers are allowed to invest in, that is standardized, would, I think, create a tremendous amount of opportunity to deploy a lot of capital where it's needed.
Wow, that was a great setup for what I wanted to talk about. Money tends to go where the solution tends to be the cheapest for the near term and not always cheapest in the long term. And that causes problems because many people require simple payback on programs that are near term. 3 years, 5 years, and 10 years tend to be the ones that you seem to see a lot. To the extent that many people who deal with this don't know how to do a net present value equation. They are not comfortable when you talk about discount rates or hurdle rates, which, by the way, is one of the great advantages of taking a master's because you got to deal with all those. And so sometimes it's very difficult to convince your decision makers of the value of long-term planning as being the most cost-effective way to do it in the long term. And this comes to the value of government, and I'm sorry if this is going to sound simplistic, but government has many functions, but one of the things that government can and should do is to help develop technologies and capabilities that are either too massive or too risky for the normal commercial areas to do. I say the space race was something that in the 1960s was not something that any company could put the money to or take the risk for. And so one of the great values of either federal and or state programs is to help support and encourage the development of the technologies that are needed to fill out those 20-year plans and 50-year plans, and when a technology is available, to start incentivizing those that are willing to take the risks of actually putting those new technologies in, testing them and using them. And believe me, that is a lot harder than it sounds, because most places where you want to test those technologies are going to be risk adverse, or they're going to want Swiss Re to come in or somebody else to come in and guarantee that if it doesn't work out well, that they're not going to be any worse off. So insurance has an issue, government has an issue, the whole issue of economic knowledge is an issue that tends to drive us towards the near-term solutions, vice the system-wide, long-term, large-scale solutions that are actually better.
Thanks, Craig. And I was actually going to bounce it back to the students, because I think, Jacob, you're raising an interesting point also on what are the, and Craig alluded to the state level as well as David, but can you talk a little bit on what the policy is that is currently being introduced in Oregon that Mike had actually discussed with you?
I'll start, but maybe we'll all contribute. We met with the state resilience officer in Oregon, Mike Harriman. He's actually was recently appointed, I believe last year, by Governor Kate Brown. So it's important to remember that this issue, even in Oregon, while people have been worrying about it, action on the state level has really accelerated in recent years. And I think the creation of his position, the SRO, really exemplifies that. And in Oregon, they're looking at a really all of the above multidisciplinary approach, because the region is at risk of flooding, wildfires, earthquakes, and storms, so everything, and landslides also, which I believe there was a Swiss Re report that touched on that a few years ago, or last year. So they don't have the luxury of not worrying about this or not worrying about the interconnections and interdependencies between risks. So they're exploring everything from, as we mentioned, earthquake insurance. They want to they're modeling a bill on California's earthquake insurance model. They're also looking at improving coordination between state agencies. So improving coordination between the state emergency officer, the Public Utility Commission, the Department of Water. We were all lucky enough to meet with representatives of those agencies and to learn about how they're trying to improve information exchange and coordination. There also are a strategic task force on this issue, and there's more work in educating legislators so that they can in turn communicate those risks to their constituents. I believe, does anyone else want to contribute?
As Annabella is saying, that Mike Harriman, the state resilience officer, he is acting like a coordinating agency, like among all the stakeholders and sectors. He's trying to mobilizing the electricity sector with represented by the PUC, Public Utility Commissions, and also for the DOGAMI, their agencies for geology and minery, and also he is putting up a report on resilience indexes, which tries to communicate all risks among all those sectors, including the electricity sector. So.
So no small task. Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I do. There's two basic points I want to make. One is that we have heard a lot about the plannings on infrastructure when we meet with the government, and then they point at a lot of strategic financing plans for the schools and hospitals, like moving the hospitals up a hill so that it will not be flooded, or moving school to safety areas. And those financing coming from the tribe and communities, they basically pool the money, and then the state is responsible for the financing. It is really difficult for them to do that in the electricity system, because basically there are the independent power producers, and then they varies by size. Also, the information, as we have discussed, the data availability on the transmission lines very limited. So the government has not been able to do it, but they're thinking about doing it in that way. Another thing is that the generations on hydropower is actually they have safety inspections every year, and then they actually do the planning they do like false alarm every year to plan who is actually responsible for what action after saying a breakdown or anything. But there's nothing that actually goes for transmission or distribution, just because of the regulatory framework is not there, as Alex have identified. And also it is really hard because the PUCs are not actually managing or guiding the utilities. They are basically providing advice. So in general, Oregon is not facing the challenge.
Yeah, and I think one last note is that the 2013 State Resilience Report was published 4 years ago, and was initially made available to the legislature only, so that they could learn about the risks that their state is facing. It's now become a public document, and there's, I think, updated versions. But if you're interested in looking at that, it's the 2013 Oregon Resilience Report. Is that right? Yeah. Okay.
So, I mean, I think this is just an interesting comment that going back to the policy question and where we can see some innovative policy on this, I think there's also some really interesting innovations happening at the state level. And part of the challenge, I would say, is on the education side, not just educating state legislature, but also related to that, the various stakeholders. And we will be curious and interested to see actually what plays out in Oregon. And I think it's worth tracking what's happening at the state level in state-led processes when innovative legislation is introduced, what the actual success rate is in helping states address that risk. And it goes directly back to the cost side. Who's actually bearing the cost? And then how do we get these incentives in place before an event actually takes place, especially when it's not necessarily a catastrophic natural disaster, but something more like a climate-related severe weather event. I think there are probably a lot more questions. However, I would encourage us all to take the questions to the back of the room. Unless there's one more burning question, we might have an opportunity to take it. Oh, please. Okay, let's take one final question.
Hi, everyone. I'm Whitney Muse. I'm a SAIS alum, and I did the practicum last year looking actually at island sustainable development. And so my question has...
And where are you right now?
I'm at NARUC now, working for
NARUC,
the international programs side. And so my question has to do with a lot of the examples have been about building back better and pre-recovery and working with electric systems that are already developed. And so in countries that are currently developing them, what are the models and kind of best practices in resilience that you've learned, both the researchers and I guess in your work at your various institutions, that can be applied to countries that are growing their energy sectors or where their populations are growing so quickly and that they're currently electrifying the populations that they don't have a system that they have to build back better. They're building it new and ideally so that it is resilient to these climate challenges.
Excellent closing question. Thank you, Whitney. Who wants to take this?
Can I just make a quick comment? That is very similar to the development of the telephone system in Kenya, where there was no landline system. They went directly from, I'm going to say, from walking and talking to cellular technology. And I think that's the same question you're asking is, how, if you don't have a large radial infrastructure already developed, what are the best practices?
Yeah, excellent.
On the energy side, a couple things that we've done that may help contribute to that. We established this partnership for energy sector climate resilience I mentioned earlier, and one of the requirements from the utilities that joined this partnership was to do a vulnerability assessment and develop a resilience strategy. What we've done is, to the degree that utilities were receptive to us making those public, we're doing that. It kind of this trips into another issue about the confidentiality of information and the challenge we have there. But to the degree that utilities are interested in making those vulnerability assessments publicly available, we're doing that. And equally important, to the degree that they're comfortable with us making their resilience strategies available, we're doing that. The other thing we've done is we've put out a couple guides in the last couple years, one supported here by ICF and another one that really is a guide to how you go about resilience planning. The one with ICF focused on sea level rise and storm surge. There's a more recent one that looked broadly across a number of climate threats. And the value of that is it really walks you through kind of a step-by-step approach for resilience planning, but in the process also identifies some best practices for which are being employed, some tools and information and methods that are out there. So I don't know if there's an easy way to make that type of information available. I'd say if you can kind of go into DOE and then go into the office that I'm from, which is the Energy Policy and Systems Analysis Office, and then go into current initiatives, and then go into vulnerabilities and resilience, you can access all the above that I've just talked about.
It's on the website.
And the end
It's
of
on
the
the
internet.
website. And what?
And the end of the internet.
You're at the end of the right.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that a little bit. That's a great program, and then there's also the grid modernization that they were talking about with DOE. I recently went to their peer review, and Lawrence Berkeley National Lab is doing a lot of great work in the model space. And for international, I was also privy to a conversation in Africa. A lot of our utilities want to invest there. And I don't know much about it, but I heard something that was quite startling. The way they assess risk can be 4 times what it really is. And I don't know what the different factors are, but it makes it really, when you're already risk averse, to have something that's that skewed, difficult to invest.
Yeah.
So you might want to look into that as well.
If I could just add on that for the developing countries, we're doing a lot of work modeling the power systems in, for example, Africa or Latin America. the main thing that stands out is the isolation of these systems. So the thing that they can do most quickly to improve the reliability and resiliency of the system is to interconnect, if at all possible, to overcome some of those hurdles. Again, we've seen very thin, sparse, isolated power systems as being very risky. There are also examples, the standout examples in the United States of that problem are the hydro utilities. So it's very interesting that you picked the Pacific Northwest. I work with some of the hydro utilities where it's 99% hydro, and they need more transmission lines, and they're isolated. So one of the issues for the Pacific Northwest is whether or not the standards that are in place are stringent enough so that you can actually make sure you have the wherewithal in terms of interconnectivity, particularly if that system goes from winter to summer peaking. But you wouldn't believe how poorly interconnected some of the African countries are to their neighbors. And I think that type of blocking and tackling is the first and most important thing to get done.
Could I just add very briefly, because I know we want to
Yeah,
break.
absolutely, and then David has a
But on the interconnected aspect, I mean, a potential way to enhance your resilience. However, make sure that if you're a utility, you mentioned Seattle City Light earlier. So traditionally, Seattle City Light comes summertime, lots of water, lots of hydropower, exceeds what they need. They ship it down to California. Okay? California, needing a lot of power in the summertime to deal with that, extra heat, those intense heat events, is expecting on relying on importing that electricity. And guess what? In the scenario you outlined, precipitation patterns are changing from snow to rain. The water's moving through the system faster, and Seattle City Light's worried about their loss of revenues to be able to sell that electricity in the future. So when we start interconnecting these systems, we need to be looking at the supply chains and making sure that not only we're not vulnerable, but the rest of the folks that we're relying on, they're not vulnerable either.
Right. Great point.
I just had one final comment, and it's more of a factoid type issue. When Hurricane Andrew plowed through central Florida, one of the surprises of the insurance industry was that homes that had solar systems on their roofs tended to keep solar systems on their roofs and their roofs on the house, whereas roofs that did not have solar systems, and the immediate thought is that it had to do with the weight of the solar system, and that is absolutely not what the issue was. It was building codes. The state of Florida required that the roof be tied to the structure of the house when you put solar on the roof. And it was the building code enforcement that basically tied the roof to the house that kept the roofs on, and the solar protected the roof shingles, and solar systems tended to respond. It was a surprise, and so the issue is that, in answering your question specifically, building codes do matter.
That's a great final word. Building codes do matter. But I do want to obviously thank our panelists here for this excellent discussion. Thank our research team. It was a pleasure serving as our faculty advisor this year. Despite one of the key challenges that we've discussed, the data availability due to confidentiality issues, they have made tremendous progress, and they're finalizing their final research. So I do want to highlight just one thing. Before you leave, these are hot off the press, straight from Zurich. This is the executive summary of the partnership between SAIS and Swiss Re this year on this. The full report will be available shortly, and you can get the other reports online as well. And I do want to actually thank Alex Kaplan for his collaboration and support in this practicum. If anyone in the audience has an interest in actually working with SAIS students in future practicums, please do see me at the end of the event. And if my colleague could just raise his hand, Professor Haskett here, and I want to thank Professor White, my other colleague here, who's been a great help to the practicum team. So please join me in thanking our panelists and our students. And there's a reception in the back, so look forward to seeing you back there. Thank you.
So Craig, I'm going to go look at your website, since we're just beginning to go develop resilience issues, starting with next year's program. We'll start bringing on